Good afternoon. My name is Chagai Etkes, and I'm one of the presenters of this briefing. We're happy to welcome you for this briefing on the economic relations between Palestinians and Israelis. The opening remarks on for this briefing will be provided by Professor Manuel Trachtenberg, the president of the INSS. Please.
It's one of our missions at the INSS to provide with expert analysis to those that deal with the thorny issues of the region, and in this case, to provide a briefing on the Israeli or the Palestinian economy, but from the point of view of the relations between the Palestinian economy and the Israeli economy. We do that, it's our way to contribute towards the meeting that will take place later this week of the donors in Brussels, right? When is it going to be, the meeting?
In 2 days from now.
In 2 days from now. There's no question that these meetings are very important. They are essentially the most important event, international event that deal with the Palestinian economy on a regular basis. And we understand that the different bodies, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Quartet, etc., they have provided already with the materials for the briefings. What we want to do here is to add a particular angle to those materials, and that is the relations between the Israeli economic policy and the impact of that policy on the Palestinian economy. There's no question that the Israeli economy is the most important factor next to the Palestinian economy, impacting every aspect of the Palestinian economy. And so we have to deal with that, to take that into account when we think about the Palestinian economy. You cannot think about the Palestinian economy on its own, but rather in the context of the Palestinian economy vis-a-vis the Israeli economy. Both Dr. Chagai Etkes and Professor Esteban Clor, two senior researchers at the INSS, are working on these issues, and they're working on it not just for this particular occasion, but on a regular basis. And the reason is, again, we understand the linkages between these two economies, and therefore, one of the new policy recommendations that will emerge from their briefing is that when we Israelis consider our own economic policies, not for the Palestinians, our own, we should take into account the secondary effects that our policies have on the Palestinian economy. So that's kind of a new angle, and they are going to elaborate on it. And within that context, I think that Israel can also take steps to help the Palestinian Authority generate more tax revenues for itself, for the Palestinian Authority. In particular, in taxing workers, Palestinian workers in Israel, not for Israeli revenues, but for the Palestinian economy. So I will let them present their briefing. As I said at the beginning, I think that the INSS should contribute to this dialogue. And the fact that we are dealing with the economic issues is somewhat new to the INSS, reflecting in part who am I. But not only, I think there is an increasing recognition that when one cannot ignore economic issues when speaking about the region and its national security. Thank you very much. Have an enjoyable afternoon. Please, Chagai.
Thank you, Professor Trachtenberg. We would like to start with the briefing. Can you please screen the slides? Thank you very much. So this briefing focuses, as Professor Trachtenberg said, on the Palestinian-Israeli economic relations. And in this respect, it is different from the international reports, which focused on the Palestinian economy per se. The outline of this talk will speak a bit about the macroeconomic conditions in the shekel zone, which in a way both Israelis and Palestinians are using the shekel, and we are de facto monetary union. We will speak about economic relations, mainly about employment and trade relations. They are the most important economic streams between the two economies. Then Esteban will elaborate on the fiscal status of the Palestinian Authority, and we'll conclude with policy recommendations. We'll start with the external environment of these economies, of the global economy in many respects. First of all, all economies here are gradually recovering from COVID-19 in the last 2 years. It's a major event that affected our labor markets and our economies. Unfortunately, in the last 2 months, we have the war in Europe, and it affects the prices of food and energy and generates more tensions, geopolitical tensions. And in the last few weeks, we have security instability. We had the attack last week in El-Ad that killed 3 civilians. And this also adds to the limits the ability of workers to enter Israel. On the economic side, we have a global acceleration in inflation. As a response, many central banks, including the Fed and the ECB, are using monetary tightening, and this will increase interest rates and may reduce investment. And in the last 2 years, we have seen an appreciation of the shekel, Israeli shekel, vis-a-vis the US dollar, euro, and the Jordanian dinar. In the last 2 weeks, we see the opposite phenomenon of depreciation of the shekel, mainly vis-a-vis the dollar. When we speak about growth, we can look on the 3 economies who are using the shekel: the Israeli economy in blue, the West Bank economy in red, and the Gazan economy in green. And we first of all notice the marked difference in level of these of the GDPs of per capita of all these regions, all these economies. But when we look at the patterns, those are quite similar. And up until the COVID, levels of productions of activity were relatively high compared to what happened after the shock, after the pandemic. And then both the Israeli economy and to a certain extent the West Bank economy recovered from the COVID-19, but Gaza is hardly recovering from that shock. And it started already the crisis from a very low level of activity of welfare, and it affects and it stayed in a very low levels even after 2 years, even 2 years after the pandemic started. We can look into the patterns of investments in the Palestinian economies. We can see on the left side the investment in fixed capital, excluding buildings, meaning machines and other means of productions. And we can see that since 2007, since Hamas overtook Gaza and there were economic restrictions on Gaza, we can see that investment in non-buildings is very low in Gaza, and practically they have 15 years of deficit in investment in economic productive capacity. The result, if we can see on the right side, is that the contribution of capital to growth in Gaza is negative in the last 15 years on average. And this is because the level of capital depreciates in the absence of additional investment over the years. So in order to recover or reconstruct Gaza, one needs to think also on the limited availability of capital there and the options to increase economic capacity in this region. If we look at the consumer prices or inflation, we can see that in all three economies, inflation is quite correlated. It went down from 2019 until 2020, until the few months after the beginning of COVID-19. And since then, it increased. However, when we compare inflation in shekel of these three economies with inflation in other economies, in Jordan, for instance, or in the West, we can observe that the inflation is relatively low in comparison to the other economies. And the reason is that the shekel appreciates during these 2 years, during the last 2 years, and moderated the prices, particularly of imported goods. Looking forward, we are afraid that inflation is likely to accelerate. The main reason is a war in Europe that inflated prices of food stuff, which are particularly important in the Palestinian economies, as 30% of their consumption is food stuff. And the war in Europe also increased energy prices, and this affects most economic activities. On the other hand, the trade reforms in Israel are likely to attenuate inflation, and we'll discuss this issue later on. Now we'll move to the Palestinian-Israeli economic relations. In this chart, you can see the flows of exports from Israel, exports from the Palestinian economy to Israel in green, the export of labor to Israel in red, and the Palestinian imports from or via Israel through Israeli companies in blue. When we compare 2021 with the previous years, both 2020, which is the year of the COVID, and also the years before, which were more normal years, we can see that the flows increased to record levels in 2021. Specifically, the Israeli exports to the West, to the Palestinian economies increased to $5.7 billion, while the Palestinian exports to Israel of both labor and goods and services increased to $4.4 billion combined. And part of the reason is the appreciation of the shekel, but even if we calculate these estimates, these flows in shekels, we can see that the sheer size of the flows on both sides increased in 2021 to record levels. If we look at the labor markets, you can see that all three economies suffered from the shock of COVID-19 in 2020, in the second quarter of 2020, and gradually recovered, as we have seen with the GDP. The levels of employment in Israel are higher than in the West Bank, and in the West Bank they're higher than in Gaza. And when we look at specifically on Palestinian employment of people, of residents of West Bank, we can see that the recovery of internal employment in Gaza, in the West Bank, was swifter. And this is a dashed red line, while the recovery of Palestinian employment in Israel took a bit longer time, and so only fully recovered only towards the end of 2021. We look at the components of employment in Gaza and the West Bank and compare them. We see here the full population of people who are 15 years and older on both territories. And we can see that overall employment rate in the West Bank was 40%, while in Gaza it was 22%. These estimates are slightly higher from the estimates in the previous slide because they include people who were temporarily absent from work. Now, when we compare the reason why employment rates in Gaza are so low, it is quite evident that the public sector and the other sector are more or less on the same size on both economies, while private sector in Gaza is particularly weak, and Gazans are hardly employed in Israel. Actually, the limited Gazan employment in Israel is not observed in the Palestinian labor force surveys. So we know that there are about 12,000 workers in Israel, but they're not captured by these surveys. As a result of the low employment rate, unemployment rate in Gaza is very high. It's around almost 50%, while in the West Bank, it is much lower. It's about 14% if I'm from the labor force participants. The weakness of the private sector in Gaza is also evident when we look at wages. Wages in the private sector in Gaza are estimated at 34 shekels per day, while in the West Bank they are almost 120 shekels per day. The private sector wages in the West Bank are affected by wages in Israel, which are much higher. They estimated by a level of wages in the West Bank, in Israel for West Bank workers, is almost 270 shekels per day. But we believe that these are underestimates because workers all over the world tend to underreport their true wages. Now, we can assess that to the extent many Gazan workers will be allowed to work in Israel, the low private sector wages may go a bit higher due to reduced supply of workers who will be moved to working in the Israeli economy. We are now looking, focusing on the West Bank economy in Israel. On the left side, we can see the employment in thousands of workers of West Bankers who are employed in Israel with permit and without permit. And we can see on the blue line that workers with permit, the number of workers with permit dropped with COVID and gradually recovered during the rest of 2020 and 2021. In contrast, when we look at the workers without permit, their numbers decreased all the way from 2018 to until the eve of COVID-19, until the beginning of 2020, and actually it increased quite dramatically during the last 2 years. If we look at the wages, we can see that wages of workers with permits were more or less stable during the period of COVID-19, while wages of workers without permit jumped with the beginning of COVID-19. And it seems that the Israeli demand for workers without permit increased at the beginning of COVID-19. And as a result, wages, where the wage gap between these two economies decreased, as we can see in the red dashed line. We actually just published today, a short policy note in Hebrew discussing the Palestinian employment in Israel during COVID and providing further evidence for the shift of Israeli demand from workers with permit to workers without permit during the 2 years of the pandemic. Another phenomenon that we observe in the Palestinian labor market as a result of the huge wage gap between wages in the West Bank and wages in Israel is that the work permits in Israel have great value. In fact, as this gives a rise to a phenomenon of trade in work permits. It's illegal in Israel. It's not clear to me whether it's legal or illegal in the West Bank, but it is conducted quite openly in the West Bank. And we use here the Palestinian surveys, the Palestinian labor force surveys that include questions on permit trade since 2019. We can see that the revenues of the permit trade, of the permit brokers and the fake Israeli employers increased last year to 1.2 billion shekels. And this is as a result of about 44% of the permit holders paid to the permit brokers, about almost 2,500 shekels per month for the permit. Now, the Israeli authorities started to make some enforcement against the Israeli fake employers, but we think that there is a need for enforcement of both sides, on both by Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities. Another step that could reduce this trade is was already announced, is obligatory wiring of wages from Israeli employers to the Palestinian workers' bank accounts. It will be mandatory from August 2022, only for Palestinian workers in Israel. And this will increase the cost of trading in permits and will make direct employment relations more profitable than buying a permit and then looking for a job in the black market in Israel. We have additional recommendations, and our main recommendation that we'll bring later on is trying to capture the proceeds of this corruption, at least part of these 1.2 billion shekels, as a fiscal source, as fiscal revenue for the Palestinian Authority. My colleague Esteban will discuss this policy recommendation later on. When you look on Gaza employment in Israel, this slide is based on short policy notes that Esteban and I published a few months ago. We can see that in late 2021, early 2022, Israel announced a renewal of entry of Gazans into Israel. Now there are about 12,000 permits for Gazans to enter Israel. Practically now they're not regulated as workers. And last month, the government decided to change the permits from entry permits to worker permits, which means that all the regulations of and the inspection related to labor laws will be in place, and to increase the quota of permits, work permits, to 20,000 workers, which is about equivalent to 4% of the Gazan workforce. Now, if we look back historically to the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the number of workers in Israel increased by 1% of the Palestinian labor force, unemployment declined by about 1.2 percentage points. So we expect that this increase in labor could reduce unemployment by 4 or 5 percentage points. If we go back to the mid-80s, we can see that almost half of the Gazan workers in 1986, 1987 were employed in Israel. And this suggests that should we remove all limitations on Gazan employment in Israel, we can expect here that about half or even more of the Gazan labor force will seek labor employment in Israel. And this means that there will be about more than 250 or perhaps 300,000 workers that would flood the Israeli market, and that could be very challenging for the Israeli workers. We'll now move to speak about Palestinian trade. These data are the Palestinian data. Earlier I showed you the Israeli data on trade. Both the Palestinian data and the Israeli data shows that Palestinian exports to Israel increased quite significantly, well beyond the appreciation of the shekel. As a result, the share of Israel as a target market out of all Palestinian exports rose from about 84% to almost 90%. When you look on the Palestinian imports from Israel, we see that it is a bit more than 50%, and actually the share of Palestinian imports from Israel declined a bit from 55 to 54%, and we can expect that the Palestinian imports from Israel will take a smaller and smaller share in the next few years, and there are a few reasons for this expected change. One reason is the reform in Israeli trade. Israel adopted in many goods the European standards instead of the Israeli standards. This means that importing goods from abroad to Israel will be easier, prices will be lower of imports to Israel, and Palestinian economies are likely to shift from importing to Israel to importing from abroad. Another reform is expected in agricultural. Israel is about to decided to reduce tariffs on agricultural produce. So this means that foodstuff and produce would be cheaper to import from abroad, including Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan, and other economies in the region. Finally, Israel and Jordan agreed on increasing the Jordanian exports to the West Bank and Gaza, to allowing an increase of these exports, or encouraging actually. So this also will shift imports from Palestinian imports from importing to Israel to importing from other economies. The last topic I would like to speak in the context of trade is the agricultural trade. Israel approved, but the implementation of this reform is pending on the political stability here. But the approved decision is to lower tariffs on agricultural produce from abroad. And we expect that lower tariffs would reduce the cost of importing produce to Gaza by about $26 million and to the West Bank by $17 million. It could reduce food prices in both economies, particularly in Gaza. It is unclear to us how it will affect Palestinian producers. According to the Palestinian data, Palestinian exports to Israel of agricultural goods declined in 2019 and 2020. It's very small, so the impact on Palestinian exports in Israel will be limited. But we don't have data on Palestinian production inside the Palestinian economies, so we cannot evaluate the impact on Palestinian producers. So far, we spoke about the macroeconomic conditions in the shekel zone and the Palestinian-Israeli economic relations. Now I would like to invite my colleague to speak about the fiscal status of the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, thank you very much, Haggai. So I'm going to address the fiscal status of the Palestinian Authority and make a policy recommendation to improve the fiscal situation of the PA. So when we look at the fiscal stance of the Palestinian Authority, we see that there is a structural deficit of around 20% in the budget of the PA. Expenditures are roughly 20% higher than revenue. And revenue coming from Israel, from taxes collected by Israel, accounts for 63% of the PA revenues. And domestic tax revenues by the PA are really small. They increased in the last year to 22%. Most of these taxes, as I'm going to show later on, are indirect taxes, and there's very negligible revenues from direct taxes. So we're going to try to address that as well. And one of the main problems of this structural deficit is, in part, was created by the decrease in external support to the PA. It used to account for, in 2016, used to account for 70% of revenues. This is money provided by the donors, and it decreased to 7% in 2021. Okay, so when we look at the money collected by Israel and transferred to the PA, here we have the absolute amounts. Most of those amounts are customs and VAT and petroleum excise. The other amount is very small taxes that are collected, and it includes income taxes paid by Palestinian workers working in Israel. Okay, so this is less than 300 million shekels. These are all mostly regressive indirect taxes. They increase inequality within the PA, and the custom revenues increase over time and account for most of the increase in clearance revenues in 2021. This shows that Israeli policies increasingly affect Palestinian fiscal revenues. In particular, Haggai talked a little bit about changing tariff. This also will affect the Palestinian budget, or when we are talking here about decreasing on the petroleum excise tax. So that may also potentially, depends on how the PA will react to that policy, may decrease revenues by 100 million shekels. Okay, so what we are proposing here, in part to address a lot of these fiscal problems of the PA, is to tax Palestinian workers in Israel in a different way than they're being taxed right now. So this tax is actually a Palestinian tax, and all the revenues from this tax should go to the Palestinian Authority. And this, we believe that such a tax will also help the Palestinian fiscal situation and will also address some problems of the Palestinian job market, where skilled Palestinian workers come to Israel to do unskilled jobs, and they don't have incentives for schooling, and they also harm local markets because all Palestinians or most of Palestinian skilled workers want to work in Israel, pushes up salaries in the Palestinian Authority for businesses working within the Palestinian Authority. And as Hagai mentioned before, this wage gap between Palestinians working in Israel and Palestinians working in the PA also incentivize illegal work permit trade. In particularly, what we see is what we could call like an unfair situation, whereas 70% of the workers in the West Bank actually work in Israel and the settlements, and they receive something like 36% of the overall wages of Palestinian workers in the West Bank. And if they were actually taxed according to the PA tax code, they would contribute around 55% of the income tax revenues by the PA. The issue is that these workers are not taxed. Palestinian workers working in Israel and in the settlements are not taxed according to the PA tax code. Palestinian workers working in Israel are taxed according to the Israeli code, and those revenues are transferred to the Palestinian Authority. And Palestinian workers working in the settlements are taxed according to or should be taxed according to the Jordanian code. The issue here is that Palestinian workers working in Israel, whereas their salaries is very high vis-a-vis Palestinian workers, is very low relative to Israeli workers. So they're basically paying very, very little income taxes here. As we mentioned before, this is less than 300 million shekels a year. And so they don't contribute much. And Palestinian workers in settlements, even though the Jordanian code is harsher than the Israeli code, and they should be paying taxes, in practice there's no enforcement of these, and they also are paying very, very little taxes. So in practice, these workers, even though they're making 36% of wages and are making wages that are much higher than wages of workers in the PA, they're actually paying less than 30% of income tax revenues. So our exact proposal is to, for example, impose a fixed fee of 700 shekels a month on employment in Israel, okay? And this will be instead of the Israeli-Jordanian tax code. If we do this based on our calculations and the fact that there are around 150,000 workers in Israel and the settlements, including workers from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip, that would generate revenues of 1 billion shekels a year. This would cover a third of the Palestinian current budget deficit. Okay, so in a way, this will partially solve the dire fiscal situation of the PA. It will also narrow the wage gap between workers in Israel and those in the Palestinian economies. As we can see on the graph on the right, the wage gap is close to 1,000 shekels. So this fee that they should pay for the work permit should be less than 1,000 shekels, so that not to incentivize illegal entry into Israel. And it will also partially address issues related to schooling incentives and the harm to local businesses and income inequality that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And importantly, right now, workers coming from the Gaza Strip, given the wage gap between their salary in Israel and their potential salary in the Gaza Strip, that creates a tax base for Hamas, which can tax those workers excessively and generate revenue for Hamas. Doing this will actually reduce that tax base for Hamas, at least by the fee of the tax. We have to be careful in terms of these fees, so that West Bank workers should not be, the fee should not be too high so that it doesn't incentivize undocumented work. We know from Hagai's previous calculations that these workers, at least 44% of these workers were able to pay close to 1,000 shekels for in the trade of permits. So 700 shekels should be below, it's below 1,000 shekels. So it should take care of that problem. In addition, regarding the security situation of Israel, where a lot of undocumented workers now, or in the past few weeks, committed terror attacks, this will also provide an incentive to the PA to cooperate with Israel in fighting the phenomena of illegal workers in Israel, because these taxes would directly go to the PA budget. So the policy recommendations, I'm going to go back to Hagai.
Yeah. So we have a policy recommendations in 3 areas: employment, trade, and fiscal. First of all, about employment, we recommend formalizing both the Gaza and the West Bank informal employment in Israel. In a way, if we think about this suggestion of collecting fees from Palestinian workers in Israel and making the quota larger, we can think about it as moving from managing the Palestinian employment in Israel by quota to managing Palestinian employment in Israel by tariff or by fees. Right. When we speak about the permit trade, we recommend enforcements by both sides. In Israel, it's illegal, but authorities started only recently to tackle the permit brokers and the Israeli fake employers. We hope that similar things will take place on the Palestinian side, and together they'll manage to eliminate this phenomenon. When we think about the permit system, we recommend continue reforming the system to account for actual employment patterns. Part of the workers employed in Israel are buying the permits because they're working 1 week with one employer and another week with another employer. And this is not possible by the Israeli permit system because it assumes that workers are working with the same employers for month after month. So providing more flexibility in the system could help reducing the permit rate. And we are happy that the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities managed to find a way to wire the wages of Palestinian workers to their bank accounts. But this is done only for workers in Israel proper. And we recommend doing it also for workers in the settlements. When we speak about trade, as Professor Trachtberg mentioned before, we think that Israeli decision makers should be aware that all decisions on trade regime are affecting the Palestinian economies. So when we liberalize or change our standards, it affects Palestinian consumers and and producers, and we need to take these effects into account when we devise our economic policy. When about fiscal policy, we have 2 recommendations. One, as my colleague Esteban elaborated, we think that taxing Palestinian workers with a fixed fee would help to both generate revenues for the Palestinian treasury, but also it could alleviate part of the adverse impact of employment in Israel on the Palestinian labor markets. And like before, like the recommendation about trade, Israel, when we make decisions about indirect taxation, such as excise or VAT or customs, we need to take into account the impact on the Palestinian economies because we are in the same custom zone and our indirect taxes are affecting the Palestinian indirect taxes. Thank you very much.